teaching called Gone Missing. And it really stems from a series of looking at the parables of Jesus in Luke chapter 15. But what are parables? Really, parables are a type of literature, a genre of literature, and Jesus used them to confront narrow thinking and expand the views of who God is. To understand a parable first is to understand its function. So I need to ask the question, what's the point of speaking in parables? Why would Jesus use this? And it basically provided a way of confronting issues with a story-like side door approach. And I studied the parables a lot, taught a class on the parables at a college level, but a parable usually has a zinger. By that I mean it has a very specific point. And so we jump into the parables. Let me set the stage. For this series, we notice that Jesus in Luke chapter 15 is talking to some Pharisees and teachers of the law. And as he talks to them, they start complaining because they don't like the fact that Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners. And who are tax collectors and sinners? Those who are not part of the Pharisees, the Judaism of the day. They basically say, you're missing it. You're wasting your time on this group that does not matter. So Jesus begins to tell us parables. The first parable is there's a shepherd who has 100 sheep. He has 99 in the fold. One is missing. He leaves the 99 and goes and looks for the one. And then he talks about a woman who's lost 10 coins. She has 10 coins, she lost one. She turns the house upside down to search and finally find the one. And today, we'll look at the parable of the lost son. Let me read it for you. It's long. Normally, we don't look at a passage this long, but I want you to get the whole story. And you can listen as I read. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to the father, Dad, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had. He set off for a distant country and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. See, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I'm going to set out and go back to my father and say to him, Dad, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Just make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. While he was a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him and ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and a robe on his feet and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, now we're going to talk about this next week more. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of his servants and asked him, what's going on? Your brother's come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours, he's your son, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father says, you're always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours, get this, see how he shifts it back, was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. These are great stories that really confront the issues that are going on. But let me just start with the way it starts. There was a man who had 2 sons. If I were a Jewish leader in those days, I'd go, yep, I know who you're talking about. There was a man who had two sons, Adam, Cain and Abel. And they said, well, those are the ones we remember. They're actually the third son, Seth. But Cain and Abel are the ones most famous. Well, there's a man who had two sons. I got it. Ishmael and Jacob. You know, Ishmael was born, those were Abraham's sons. Ishmael was from Hagar, and Isaac, was from Sarah. So Ishmael and Isaac. There were a man who had two sons. No, that's not it. It's Jacob and Esau, the two sons, or Esau and Jacob. But what I want to point out, though, in each instance of these sons being mentioned, the younger outperformed the older brother. There was a man who had two sons. Next week, I'm going to talk to you about, did the younger one outperform the older? We'll examine that. I want to tease you a little bit in this sermon, because next week, as much as I say this week, you may like it, but next week is going to be awesome. You're going to love it. So a couple of questions that we begin to ask as I look at this. Why would the father give this younger son all the resource that he gave him when he obviously was not ready to handle it? Good question. Of course, I have my own questions. Why does God allow a 16-year-old to drive? Right? That's a good question. Why does God allow drinking, drugs? Why does he allow us to do stupid things? Maybe the answer has something to do with free will. These are good questions, and I like to ask the questions, but we could get sidetracked in this parable if we're not careful. That's not the primary understanding. But what is this story trying to teach us? Well, it's going to teach many things, but I'm going to pull three things out today. And they're in your notes. You can fill in the blank with if you want. But here's the first suggestion. Number one, there's often a tension between where I am and where I want to be. Now, the tension in this parable initially is between the father and the younger son. The younger son comes and says, Dad, would you go ahead and give me my share of the estate? And to get the full impact of the story, you have to understand Middle Eastern families did not operate that way. A Middle Eastern dad would never divide up his estate before he was dead. Usually it was on his deathbed. And he'd call the oldest one in and give him the blessing. You're going to be my heir. You're going to have a double portion of whatever I give the other kids. You get twice as amount. And you're the one who's really going to stay here and be a part of that leads my family. And then the second son would come in and say, you didn't get the first blessing. What you get is the microwave and the barbecue grill. You get the things not quite as good as what the first son gets. So that's kind of what happens, maybe the motorcycle. And that's how it was done in that day. But in this unusual story, this bold young man approaches his dad and says, Dad, give me my share. Dad, what I'm really asking, do what you'd never do. Give me my share so that I can do with it whatever I want. There seems to be something that happens with that, a sense of entitlement, a sense of give it to me so I can do whatever, it belongs to me. But those Jewish leaders, those Pharisees, those teachers of the law would have been gasping, say, no way, dads just don't do that. And Jesus is really trying to say, but the father figure in this story is not your typical Middle Eastern dad. He has a higher place, and it really is symbolic of God. And so in the story, the father hands over the cash. The boy holds out his hands, takes the money, puts it in his pockets, and he gets on his new Harley. He's got his stereo blaring with Steppenwolf singing Born to Be Wild as he drives away from the compound out to do his own thing. Maybe a little ad-lib there. But anyways, give me what is mine so I can do with it what I please. I'm entitled to it. And when he received his share, he left home. Now, I asked, is it so bad to leave home? Most of us leave home at some point in our adult life. What is seen as leaving home by some is seen as is perceived as growth by others. When I was in high school, 16 years old, I moved out and rented an apartment. 16. I had a job. I thought I want to be out of my family's home. And at 16 years old, I rented a place. A few months later, I go, what am I thinking? This is expensive. And I'm doing all my money to pay rent. I'll move back home where it's free. And I moved back home. But at 17, I graduated from high school at 17. I came home. I'd been in Switzerland for 2 weeks. I came back. My job, I'd been laid off from my job. I went home and packed up my car In an hour's notice, I had this 1967 blue Camaro, put all my stuff in it from St. Petersburg, and drove 750 miles to Nashville. And I thought, well, if I'm going to get a job, I'm going to school in the fall, I might as well start here. I had a sister that lived there who could let me house there with her for a while. I stayed away for 5 months. I never came home from July until the end of November. And I remember longing to come home. It just been, I just turned 18. I've never been gone from home that long. I remember driving back from Nashville down the interstate and the John Denver song was on. Hey, it's good to be back home again. You know that song? Man, I was singing that song and I was crying. I just could not wait to get home. I got home and I saw my mom and my dad and my brothers and my sisters. The next day I was ready to go back. It doesn't take a lot. But there's something that happens when you live away. You realize, I don't really want to live here again at this time. But 5 months and a day was enough. See, these psychological principles are seen in the story. And they're fun to look at, but that's not really the point of the story either. But a journey from a father or family is common in growth development. You can see it throughout many places in the Bible, a parallel between the lost son and Adam. Adam and the young son made choices that took them away from home. And, there's many scholars, and I'm one who believes that, I don't think Adam was ever intended to live in the garden forever. Part of being human is being aware and working and understanding that God is with you no matter where you go. But was a younger son supposed to remain in his father's house? Why would he leave? And there's some other reasons I want to suggest why he left. I'll tell you that next week. Because you're going to go, oh, I didn't think of that. But he took what was his. He decided to leave the comfort of his home. He was away from home. He was away from rules, regulations. He discovered what I call, and what philosophers called, hedonism. And some of you say, I don't know what that is. Well, let me explain what hedonism is. Hedonism is living for pleasure, living for pure pleasure. Does it sound like a college freshman? You leave home, you do what you want to do, no watchful eye, irresponsibility galore. What happened? Everything was great. And for a while, life was just one big hedonistic party, having fun, doing all the things he wasn't allowed to do. No sense of morality. He's living large, he's living his way. Which leads me to the second observation, and it's this. There's often a tension between what I have done and what I become. See, it wasn't long before he was broken, penniless, bankrupt. He spent his money, according to his brother, on prostitutes and wild living. It wasn't long before his whole life was spinning out of control. Why? Because there's a tension between what you do and what you become. The way he was living led to a lifestyle and a position in life that really was not where he wanted to be. So what did he do? I got to get a job. I've spent all my money, I have to get a job. So what am I going to do? Well, the only job offered is feeding pigs. But you don't understand, I'm Jewish. We don't like to deal with pigs. Not just pigs, but I have to feed the pigs. And the story became so bad because he longed to eat the food that was being fed to the pigs. And these Jewish guys that Jesus was telling this parable, they're just got it repulsed. You got to be kidding me. This is horrible. It's as repulsive to these Jewish leaders as someone being served a rare ribeye steak at a vegan convention. You can imagine how repulsive that would be. Jesus wants them to feel how the son felt who left home. He also wants to describe how far away from home this young son had drifted. The shepherd lost one sheep, just 1%, 1 out of 100. But he was diligent about recovering that. The lady who lost the coin, 1 out of 10, that's 10%. She was turning the house upside down to recover it. But here's a father who had 2 sons, and one was lost, 50%. Here's what he's teaching. God is never satisfied until 100% of his children are right where they need to be. The son had wandered down his own path. He'd lost his way. And at this point in the story, the whole story begins to change. broken and hungry, Jesus tells this group, the son comes to his senses. And I love the phrase, he comes to his senses. He realizes, what am I doing? You ever felt that? You ever had a place in your life you go, what am I doing? My life's a mess. I'm broken. It's not that I've blown my inheritance or I'm hungry. It's that I have hurt people around me. I've damaged relationships. Maybe, what am I doing? I've said something that got me dismissed from my job. I just really have made a mess of things. And now I'm in a place to where, I want to eat pig's food, the pods that pigs eat. But I come to my senses. Even the guys that work for my dad have it better off than I do. Listen carefully. Some of the greatest transformation that happens in your life and mine occurs when we're at the bottom or we're in the pig pen. When we've wasted, when we've blown it. And I'll tell you, when you get there, it seems like, oh, I can't get out. Famine is all that follows. And he transitioned from a wealthy son of a wealthy man to the bottom of the scale, as bottom as you could get. And here's the question I would say, who is responsible? It's a good question. Was it God, the Father? Some people say, yeah, that's just God's plan. He made all this happen. I don't think that's my opinion. Some people would say, was it the older brother who created some of this? And next week, we're going to look at that. And then, but maybe it's his own fault. Do we ever want to take personal responsibility? If we're ever going to grow, we have to say, it's me. I'm the problem. Which leads to the third concept today. I want to bring it out to you. There's often a tension between what I become and what I wish I could be. It's my fault. I'm the problem. I made the choice, and when I admit that, the possibility of transformation occurs in my life. But if it's always your fault or you did this to me, I blame you and I can't change you and nothing seems to change. I just live a life of blame. But if I see it as my choice and my decision and my fault, then there is a great possibility of transformation. But there's often a tension between what I become and what I wish I could be. A friend of mine here in Sarasota, a few years ago, he told me he was moving from Florida to North Carolina. Yeah, I was with him. I was at his house, and he was trying to sell his house. And he had this boat up on davits behind his house on the canal, and it was a 30-foot Grady White. And I've known this guy for decades. And he said, yep, I'm moving to North Carolina. I'm selling my boat. I go, wait a minute. This boat was your dream boat. 30-foot, twin-engine Grady White, all the electronics. I know you. You dreamed about this boat, and now you have it. He said, that's true. He said, but dreams change. And all of a sudden, I had an aha moment, and I go, how true. Dreams do change. When you are young, you dream of getting older. When I was young, I had 8 brothers and sisters. My dream was just survival. When I got to be a teenager, my dream was surviving my dad. And then I got married. My dream has been to survive my wife. I mean, it's just about surviving. But as you grow older, dreams change. Maybe you dream someday that, the most important thing in your life is to get wealthy. And I know a guy that years ago, a friend of mine who sold a business for $50 million. He said, my dream was just to be mega wealthy. And he said, I am. He said, please tell your congregation, there's no life fulfillment. It's just money. You need people and relationships and God. That's where value is. Do dreams change? Of course they do. And they should. Life is dynamic. It's changing and growing. And this story illustrates how dreams change. But I'm amazed how our perspective changes in the low points of human existence. I was talking to another friend of mine. Some of you know this guy. He's in jail, probably going to prison. He called this week, and he said, I made some bad choices, including theft and drug use. But before he went down that road, he has a lot of friends who said, don't do this. He was warned by friends, by his pastor. He was coached, counseled, helped, encouraged, and his addicted mind just ignored it all. He ended up doing some things he shouldn't have done, including theft, and he's in jail maybe for prison. But after being in a couple of months, I could tell on the phone his mind was clear. And he sees what his decisions led him to. And this is what he said. I know these are consequences. I made the choice, and it wasn't my best self who made the choice, but I made the choice. And whatever the consequences are, I accept them. It's too bad that it often takes the low points in life before we begin to see clearly. In the pig pen, in this story, he came to his senses. And you know what he said? I can never return as a son. I burned that bridge. But my father's hired servants have it so much better than I am. Maybe I'll just go and say, just hire me. You have food in abundance, and I'm starving to death. And when we come to our senses, we can begin to see our life a little more clearly. And one of my hopes for you today is that you see your life clearly today for who you are and what you can become. And when we come to our senses, the possibility of change is there. Look at the decision of this young man. I'll go back home. And I think for each of us, we have the choice to make our way back where our heart is. I mean, he realized he began to be in need. He was aware he can go home. Things are better at home. And it was a critical decision. I'll go back. Then he said these words, I'm no longer worthy to be called a son. Wow, what insight. But my question is, was he ever worthy? I'll go back as a servant. I'll go back humble. I'll go back surrendering my ego, my status, my will to my Father. What really changed for this son? Where do we see the way things have shifted? He was no longer full of himself. He was no longer entitled. He no longer had any claim to estate. He said, I'm just going to go back and just become a hired hand because I think that life, I've seen it. And I gave up so much because of my stupidity. I just want to go back as a hired hand. I'm going to go home. And as he wandered toward home and he got close, and I don't know exactly how far he was, maybe from here to Clark Road, maybe a quarter of a mile, but all of a sudden, his father saw him coming back home. And his father ran to his son. His father, and as he runs toward him, if I'm the son and I see this Middle Eastern guy, one of the things they don't do, they don't give away their estate early and they don't run. It's a matter of elegance. And all of a sudden you see this guy, this chic-looking guy, running toward you. I think I might have turned around and said, yeah, you'll never catch me. He's old and slow and I'm young and fast. He'll never catch me. But he didn't. And his dad ran up to him and he embraced him. And he kissed him. And the boy said, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And his dad said, in my words, thanks, but stop talking like that. You always have been and always will be my son or daughter. Welcome home. Can I pray for you? Father, thank you for the message of love and grace today. That all of us here, we are a son or daughter of God. Forgive us when we think that we are not worthy, and maybe we're not, but you love us anyway, and that makes all the difference. Father, thank you for the way that you're working in our hearts and lives. You're challenging us to be a better person, and because of you, that's occurring in us. My prayer is that we'd always reflect the image of our Father in our lives. We pray in his name. Amen. Would you stand, please? I'm going to tell you a story in closing. And as I do, remind you that if you want to pray, there's someone up front, no matter what's going on in your life. If you needed someone to pray for you, there's someone here who would be delighted to pray with you. But there's a Spanish fable that I heard about years ago. It's about a father and son who had a real falling out with each other. Man, words were said on each side, big wounds, cutting words. The son just said, I just can't take it anymore. And he left. He disappeared. He said, you won't see me again. After a few days, the father realized how wrong he was. And he was desperate to find his son. He searched for him everywhere. Couldn't find him. Finally, it was in Madrid. He put it in the Madrid newspaper, this ad. Madrid's a city of 6 million people. He said, this is what it said. Dear Paco, Please meet me this Saturday in front of the newspaper office at noon. I am so sorry. All is forgiven. I love you, your father. On Saturday at noon, he went down to the newspaper. 800 Pacos showed up. They're just looking for the love of their father. Deep down, all of us are a little Paco today, aren't we? I'm just here to remind you that you have it. He loves you. He loves you, and when you stop running, he will run to you. He loves you today. So do I. God bless. Thanks for coming.